Today we looked at Deuteronomy. It's not a Hebrew scroll that we often read from in the Christian church, but today we open it up and we find the practice of giving first fruits. It's an instruction to the people, but it's an important one in terms of identity. And you might not think of it that way, but Israel was to celebrate the spring harvest as a way first of giving thanks to God for leading them in the Exodus. And then second, it was a reminder that they were once a people wandering in the wilderness, that once they were slaves, and now they are free, they are liberated, and they have a land of their own. But I think if we look a little bit deeper, we might uncover another meaning for this instruction. Because when people forget their past, they lose sight of their present, of who they are, and of what the future might look like. So for Israel to forget the sheer relief and joy in being delivered from slavery, from oppression, is to forget what shaped them. It's to forget who holds them. And it's to forget whose and who they are. And so it's no accident that this text is paired with Jesus' time in the wilderness. And I think that understanding the Hebrew Scriptures helps us understand who Jesus was, because of course, Jesus' education was steeped in the Hebrew text. And so this Lent, any Lent, we are afforded the opportunity to recall the story of Jesus. And we once again journey to the cross and beyond. And so we begin with Luke. And here there are three temptations. Brian plays a pretty good statement, doesn't he? The three temptations echo lessons that Israel learned. And the responses that Jesus gives come directly from the scroll of Deuteronomy and the story of Israel's time in the wilderness. So let's look at them each on their own. The bread and the manna. God's provision came new every day in the wilderness. The manna wasn't to be stored up for it wouldn't last, but it was always sufficient that the people had enough to eat. And manna, translated in the Hebrew, means what is it? And so we might say, what is it that truly feeds us? But the second thing that Satan showed Jesus was power. But Jesus refuses to trade his relationship with God for power. He responds by saying, worship the Lord your God and serve only him. And it resonates with the warning in Deuteronomy about following other gods when the people get to the promised land. You remember the golden calf, right? It would be so tempting to forget whose they are when power and privilege are there to be grabbed. It was no different then. It's no different today, too. And then Jesus brought to the top of the temple. Now this one is not so obvious, but the reference comes from earlier in Deuteronomy about the story of Massah, M-A-S-S-A-H, where the people were thirsty and they quarreled with Moses and they pled to God, and finally Moses strikes his staff on a stick and there's water that comes from the rock. So the response from Jesus, do not put the Lord your God to the test, is as the way God was tested in Massah. And so, Jesus' time in the wilderness, obviously, fasting, not eating, he's hungry, he's probably half out of his mind, but yet he still has this deep faith foundation. And that time in the wilderness came right after his baptism, where he was blessed by the Holy Spirit, identified and told by God that he is God's beloved Son. And so here in the wilderness, with that in his heart, the wilderness trials and temptations shape him. He went out and faced demons, and he learned deep in his soul who he was. and what he was to do amongst the people. And so he comes away from testing and temptation, knowing whose and who he is. And in so understanding, he models a different way of living for us. And now we enter the wilderness of Lent. It's a time that we can remember our own stories, our stories of faith, our stories of life, our experiences, as we journey with Jesus, thank God, for 40 days and not 40 years. Now, Lent has historically been a time of penitence. It's a time of fasting, leaner time. But what if we looked at these next weeks as a gift instead? What if we thought about them as a gift, where we have been invited to take time to talk with God. Take time to remember who you are, that you are a child of God, just like I told the children. To take time to discover what might be in store for you. Maybe you want to take time to lay aside something that tempts you. Maybe you want to place down a burden that weighs you down. Maybe you want to take the time to ponder a different path, something new in your life. Most of all, it's a time to look at Jesus again, and to look to Jesus again, to see our trials and our temptations in the light of His, and think about where we are now, who we are now, and think about who we could be as a people and as a church. There's so much possibility. I ask those questions, and once again, I'll repeat that those pieces of paper, if you have them in your pews, or if you don't, there's some up on the piano, to write down something that tempts you that you want to lay before God, or a new direction, or a burden. Take that paper, wrap it around a stone, and place it on our cairn that's just beginning, as we begin this journey together with God through Lent.